Okay, here, welcome to another episode of On the Restroom Off the Cuff. Today, a really cool update for you from the brand Doxa. A little about them: they were established all the way back in 1889, and later they were acquired by the Yeni family in 1997, beginning its most recent modern era of watchmaking. In terms of the watches, these are Swiss-made, and they are a heritage micro brand, high quality, retro vintage inspired, of course, within that mid-tier category, best known for their subline developed in partnership with the diving legend Jacques Cousteau. Now, in terms of dive watches, some key common characteristics in design when you're looking for a diver, of course, you're going to want to find a screw down crown to provide some extra water resistance. You're going to want something that's tough, legible, with a dive time bezel, and a diver's extension is always nice if on bracelet, or in this case, even on a fitted rubber strap with that full diver's buckle, which is awesome. This is their sub 200T in the silver dial Searambler format, and it's really quite a handsome piece. Of course, it looks like a Doxa, but what is very different are the ultimate scale, and a lot of the proportions have definitely changed for this release, and I'm excited to get it hands-on with you guys. Big shout out to Doxa for sending this piece in. Just as a loaner, I do have to send it back, but it's probably good because it is very small, and I know some of you are thinking, oh, well, this is just a smaller 39mm take on their iconic subline of dive watches. But if you guys have watched my channel, you know I've reviewed their full-sized pieces, and they wear much smaller because of their proportions. So it's not just the ultimate specs. Again, it's that proportion, that dial to bezel to case ratio that really decides how a watch will wear in the metal. I will say this is beautifully constructed, and at the price of $1,550 direct from Doxa, I think it's still quite a deal. So with all that said, let's go ahead, zoom the camera out, get this piece in hand, and take a closer look. All right, off the bat, one thing you're going to notice is this doesn't lay flat. This is a fitted end rubber strap, and honestly, it gives you all the benefits of a bracelet apart from it being steel. So if you thought it might weigh you down, or maybe that aesthetic with the beads of rice bracelet as signature as it is might not be quite modern and contemporary enough for you and your tool watch needs, I think this is a really nice option. And fortunately, it's actually fitted to a size, although it is just a loaner, that will actually fit my wrist pretty nicely. So looking forward to that. But let's go ahead and go over some of the dimensions. So 39mm in diameter, just 10.8mm thick. That is, including every piece there. Of course, it does have a flat sapphire, so it's going to wear really true to that thickness. Also, 41.5mm lug to lug. That is important. That is very short. 41.5mm, that is smaller than some watches in terms of their diameter, right? So very tidy. 316L stainless steel, guys. Really nice thin 4mm mid case in terms of that side profile, which is nice, which is only slightly thicker than actually their full size models, which were a little under 4mm, which was really one of the nice things that kind of was able to redeem the overall dimensions in terms of them just having some really dialed in proportions here. I think that proportion being a little bit thicker does help give this a more of a feeling of robustness, because it is quite undersized for a lot of wrists. Now, I know some of you are screaming, well, 39mm is undersized. Again, there's more to it, guys. This is only 35mm across the bezel, guys. 35mm across the bezel. Yes, 35mm across the bezel, and you can see the dial to bezel ratio is quite large. So even if you had a 35mm watch, you would typically have a larger dial than this dial opening here, guys. The dial opening is under 26 millimeters, so very, very small dial. And this iteration, in terms of the Searambler, with that nice silver sunray dial, it probably does the best job of actually blending its dial in with the bezel, with the case. So if anything, this is probably the one that will be most versatile in terms of sizing, making the visual impact a little bit larger. In other cases where you have that contrasting dial, it's going to draw your eye inwards and it's going to make it look even smaller. Here you guys can see that brushing on the bezel insert flows beautifully with that dial. So again, that helps elongate it, and it's still, again, quite small. But it's tidy, it's good. And there's plenty of people that have smaller wrists. Like if you have 6.5-inch wrist and you would never wear a Doxa just because you have a small wrist, perfect for you. But if you have like an average wrist, if you're anywhere near 7 inches or especially above, then this is going to be too small, which is fine because they still have some great options for you in their more full-sized offerings, which is great. So the sapphire is flat, which does, you know, it helps with the thinness here, and I'm sure proportionally it helps keep things a little bit more tidy, which I think is smart. I do love that box dome that you're going to find on it. Again, they're more traditional sub 300, but this 200T looks great. You also are going to get a bit of an inner air coating, so you can of course still see this at various angles, which is great. You're getting 120 clicks in terms of that rotating bezel, which is nicely done considering how small it is. You would almost worry, but really nice. Fast or slow. Nice balance of clicky and smooth, right? You don't want it to be too harsh to where you don't even want to turn it, and you don't want it to be too smooth to where it just feels mushy and like your inputs aren't really, worth anything. So I think this does have a nice balance from that perspective. Also, the grips here, the teeth on the bezel are very nice. It's that signature grip, as you guys can see, and it is definitely very tactile and works out quite nicely from that perspective. Now, although you can't see it inside, you're going to have probably a Sellita SW200, which has a 38-hour power reserve, beats at 4 hertz, and which is going to translate to about 28,800 vibrations per hour in terms of that beat rate. So nice and smooth, guys. And you can see, of course, this is a nicely done Swiss-made piece. Doxa, Swiss-made. Getting into the dial, very straightforward silver dial with that printed indexing. You do have the date at 3 o'clock, which actually has a pretty nicely beveled window there, guys, as you guys can see. Nice little detail they probably didn't have to do and could have got away with omitting, but the fact that they did just shows, again, that attention to detail. You're getting Swiss Superluminova, which hasn't been specified, but we'll take a look at that here in a bit. It does have, of course, 20 atmospheres or 200 meters of water resistance, which is going to equal out to about 656 feet of water resistance. 18 millimeter lugs, so it's not going to be quite the strap monster you would get with the 20 millimeter lugs you're going to find on the more standard sizing. And it does have this beautiful fitted end FKM rubber strap with that milled push button folding clasp, which does have the ratcheting dive suit and extension. And again, this is a ratcheting extension. This is not a micro adjuster. That's not, like, why would you want to have your buckle open like that? Like, if you have to, right, you get stung by a bee or something, you just absolutely have to extend it. Maybe you're out taking this up up into the mountains, and you just want to have this on the outside of your coat so you don't have to readjust your gloves and your sleeve every time. This is going to work great for that, but I don't want to give anybody the illusions that this is somehow going to be great for micro adjust fitment, because it should fit perfectly like this, and then if you have to let it out, then you do, and that's fine. One click isn't going to hurt anybody. But if you're trying to find the in-between space on any one of these holes and you make a mistake, overcut, undercut, and you're relying on this for fitment, I mean, that is not an elegant solution at all, and it's not meant to be. So I don't want anybody to be judging this as a micro adjust on the fact that it is not that. It is a it's a ratcheting dive suit extension. Unfortunately, there's so many people that are just so over obsessed with bullet points and specs that they see something like this and they say my watch needs to have that. But this is the most crude, bad execution of a micro adjust. I would much rather have manual micro adjust holes than to try to use this as a micro adjust. So just don't get that confused, guys. Now, with all that said, this does have a nice shape to it. It is beautifully contoured, as you can see. It even has a little flare out step. So it's going to step out to 20 millimeters. So it's going to help, right? Visually, I know some people are like, ah, man, 18 millimeter lug, that's not going to look good. All right. 20 is what it's visually going to look like because of that little step, and it's going to taper back down to about 18 millimeters on the clasp end. But with that said, let's actually get it on the wrist and see how it wears. Okay, guys, as you can see on my 7.5-inch wrist, at least to my eye, it's just too small. I know some of you are probably just looking at your screen going, oh, I think that's really doable. I think that's nice. Well, it's just, of course, if I get my wrist a bit too close to the camera, it's going to make it look even bigger. So you're going to probably see pictures like this on Instagram, and you might think, oh man, that 39 millimeter might be the one for me. Again, guys, the full size model for me, if you have a 7-inch wrist or even near that, I have 7.5-inch wrist, and it is quite a round wrist at that. So it's not like super wide and flat and accommodating. So again, there's elements at certain angles, but I would say at most angles, I look down at this and it just feels too small. Unless you're planning to wear this specifically to try to wear a small watch, then that's what you're gonna find here. If you're like, hey, I don't want anything oversized, this again is short of full size. I consider this a mid-size piece. And if you do have a really small wrist, again 6.5 or below or something in that area, this is going to be great for you. This is going to be fantastic, and I'm glad that you're able to find this video so you can have a little bit more perspective on the details of this piece. But what I like to do, right, is actually tighten up the frame here so you guys can still get a detailed look while just keeping it at a bit of a truer aspect ratio. And you can see how well centered it is on my wrist with that 41.5 millimeter lug to lug there, guys. And again, it's not obscenely, like, I wouldn't be embarrassed to wear this piece by any means, but yeah, it's just not my cup of tea in terms of the fitment. It is just, again, 35 millimeters across the bezel, guys. If I wouldn't wear a 35 millimeter watch normally and be comfortable with that, I'm probably not going to be comfortable with this diver with a bezel that's going to be at 35 millimeters. And yes, the case does overhang, and it does give you that extra size ultimately. But yeah, in terms of the proportions here, guys, I'm definitely sticking to the sub 300 in terms of my preferences, although this is really well built, really well done. And I think, again, for a small wrist, this is really just going to be quite heaven sent, really. So with that said, let's actually get this off the wrist, set up for some Lume shots, low light transition, and closing thoughts. Okay, let's go ahead and hit the lights here. And check that out. Very nice. Doxa is not really known for their Lume, so it's not like there's tons to expect here. I think it still does the job. Of course, these are printed indexes and whatnot, so there's only so much you can kind of expect. Also, that Lume pip, although it's very visible, of course, in well-lit situations, the Lume on it itself is going to fade quite a bit faster, and it's going to dim quite a bit faster compared to the rest of the Lume on the dial and handset. But one thing I always like to work in, of course, is going to be a bit of a low light transition, and that's because you're not always going to be out in the middle of a field enjoying direct sunlight. A lot of times you're going to find yourself coming in and out of buildings, walking underneath overhangs, or just hanging out underneath the shade of a tree. So it is nice to see what these colors, textures, and finishes render like in less than optimal lighting here, guys. And I think this is a gorgeous piece. Again, I have no problem with the aesthetic of Doxa. I think they're definitely a brand that can be quite polarizing, but I do think it's all of these little functional details that actually come together to give it its signature look, and it's what makes it look like a Doxa. So, don't fill the comments with, oh, they should make this a no dial, and they should make this part more traditional and give it a regular bezel insert, and basically wash this all the way out to where it's just like any other watch. Like, the whole point of getting a Doxa is to have something that looks like this. This is their signature iconography. They do an amazing job, and they're finally again opening the door for much smaller wrists. Much smaller, although I will say if you have a smaller wrist, you are probably okay with the larger variation, although you might be a little worried about those ultimate dimensions. Again, very small and tidy dial and much smaller bezel, so those ratios keep it very wearable. In this case, at the smaller scale, are going to make it a little bit less wearable for those with larger wrists, versus I think the larger model, which can be a bit more versatile for a wider range of wrists. And again, if you're really into small watches, then you might enjoy something like this. Like if you're wearing really small diameter pieces, a vintage Casio, or say Casio vintage, doesn't necessarily have to be actual vintage Casio, but they can just be those re-releases that are quite small. You're wearing a bunch of little Cartier tanks and stuff like that. If that's your jam, if a 35 millimeter watch is something that you have in your arsenal that you wear comfortably, then having this piece would make sense with that. But again, if you're somebody whose dress watches are going to be like 36, 38 like myself, then this is going to unfortunately be just a hair too small, which is kind of a bummer, because at the decreased cost, right, at just $15.50, it's definitely cheaper than you're going to pay as if you were to get a 300. So the Doxa 300, though, you're going to get that chronometer grade movement, which is nice as well. But this is just a looker, guys. Look at this thing. Plays with the light beautifully, still stays very, very legible, but you guys can see that bezel pip is already faded pretty well, but the dial is holding up pretty decently, especially considering again that it's just printed. I will say it is pretty nicely and thickly applied in terms of that lume though. So with that said, I guess we could get into some closing thoughts here. So all right, guys, on the wrist, the classic sub 300 was the smallest wide watch and the thinnest thick watch, right? It nailed its kind of odd function forward aesthetic with an eccentric proportions that really shrunk everything down on your wrist. Now, this newer sub 200T does more of the same, but at an even smaller scale, so it does make it feel a bit too small for my 7.5-inch wrist. Again, that's my preference, guys. You might have a bigger wrist in mind and say, I love tiny watches on my wrist, and that's fine. I have nothing against you or that, but for me, I'm definitely going to be leaning more towards the standard size of the sub 300 in terms of the classic sizing. Unfortunately, that means I'm going to be paying a lot more whenever that time comes. So yeah, I would really recommend this size range for those with wrists well under 7 inches. I think if you're even approaching 7 inches, you should probably be going for the full-sized variation. But again, if you are, somebody who wears long sleeves all the time and you want a diver you can tuck, not that I would recommend a Doxa for that, but this is probably the closest you will get to something like that, then I think that's where this has a space to really thrive. In terms of model variants, the sub 200T is available in 8 different dial color variants with options on bracelet or strap, which is great. And then in terms of comparable models, I would say this is definitely within a similar niche vein as something like Squale or Zodiac, but typically held in a higher prestige and regard within the collector community. No knock against Zodiac or Squale. I think those are also great watches that I own. I actually don't own a Doxa, but I'd like to. It's not off the table. I just have had other watches that I've wanted to get to first. So in terms of the bottom line here, guys, this is an iconic silhouette from a beloved brand. which now can be enjoyed by even more abundant range of wrists. So that's all good news here, guys. So again, hopefully I didn't sound too harsh on the smaller sizing. Unfortunately, it's just way too small for me with that 26 millimeter-ish dial and that 35 millimeter bezel. So with that said, guys, 39 millimeters is typically a sweet spot for me, but I would say that's why it's so important to get pieces in the metal, because you cannot just rely on ultimate dimensions to tell you what is going to wear well or not so well on your own wrists. And then of course, you know, your own preferences. And then you think about, just as from this video, right, like the skew you can get from lens, from, you know, how close a lens is and the different focal lengths and your perspective being quite warped, as opposed to, you know, how something is going to render in person, under natural lighting conditions to your own eyes. So there's just a lot to think about there. This is a great piece if you have the wrist small enough for it. Everybody else, I think, definitely keep saving up for that 300 classic sub. So with that said, let me know what you all think down in the comments below. If you like the video, please do like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.